next up is Amy, third talk about monitoring today. And she will actually tell you about the Pinterest story and how they actually redesigned, I think, their internal monitoring, made it more intuitive, made it easier to understand for new employees that onboarded. Is it there? Yep. Cool. So please welcome Amy.
Hi, everyone. Today, I'm really glad that I came up to talk after these two great talks about Prometheus. And today, for my talk, we're going to talk more about the user side. So what is it like to be a customer who's using all of these time series tools that your monitoring team might be providing? And so let's get started. I'm Amy. I found this picture of my first passport because I'm really excited to be here in Germany with you all. I joined Pinterest in 2015, and for most of that time, I've been on our visibility team. So we are the ones who offer all of our monitoring tools. So some of the things I worked on in the past year would include, we did some distributed tracing with Zipkin. We provide some data visualizations in D3. And we started writing our own caching system for OpenTSDB. And those are all things that I'd love to talk to you all about at another time. But most importantly, what I've been working on over the past 6 months or so has been overhauling the user experience of our monitoring stack. And so we had a lot of issues with how people were using our tools in the past and ways that it was confusing. So we identified a bunch of ways of how we could improve that. And I want to share those lessons with you today. Also, you can reach me on the internet, on Twitter, and on my homepage over there. So I'll give you a sense of Pinterest scale in case you aren't familiar with our team. We have 150 million monthly active users. We have 100 billion pins, and a pin is an image or a link that someone saves on the website. And we have about 2 billion boards. I'm just going to move this closer to me. But the numbers I think are more exciting are the numbers on our monitoring side, more relevant to this audience. So we take in about 150,000 requests per second. We log 20 terabytes of data per day. We take in about 2.5 million metrics per second. And this one is, I think, the most important metric. We have over 400 engineers, and of course, we're still growing. So with our team of 8 visibility team engineers, we are trying to support Pinterest monitoring and scale with the size of how many engineers we have right now. So because we're we're growing pretty big, we've been developing our own in-house monitoring tools. So some people might be using Grafana or Prometheus, Grafana with Prometheus. We use OpenTSDB and Graphite, and we build our own front end called StatsBoard. And so you might think of this as our own version of Datadog, but with our own custom features. So you can use dashboards. You can explore different metrics. In this case, you can just type in a metric and see how it looks without needing to build a whole dashboard just to see what's going on. And you can build up your own alerts off of time series data, which is a great thing that Bjorn was just talking about. So these are all things that we've built in-house in the past year. So I wanted to move into a story about how I got started on the monitoring team at Pinterest. I actually had started out on a different team, and one of my projects was related to monitoring. So I spent a lot of time using StatsBoard, the tool I was just showing off, and I found it to be a terrible experience. We had really bad, outdated documentation. All of the instructions were wrong, so I would copy a command, paste it in, and realize it didn't work anymore. I would post questions on our Slack channel, and nobody would answer, and so I had no guidance. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was going on with StatsBoard, and then I spent a bunch of time committing code to fix bugs in StatsBoard, even though that wasn't the mission of my team. And so Pinterest, of course, like many startups, we went through a reorg, and that's when I had the chance to jump over to visibility and make fixing StatsBoard my full-time job. And so my motivation, based on my experiences on my past team, was to, I guess, make StatsBoard better for all the users who are just like me, all of the engineers across our org who had a terrible time using StatsBoard. And so I had a lot of time to think about what it means to be a good engineer, what it means to be a 10x engineer based on all of this. And so I think it means something different based on what kind of engineer you are. So maybe if you're a product engineer or a growth engineer or a monetization engineer, it might mean a different thing. But for most of us in this audience, we're all working on some kind of infrastructure scaling team, or maybe site reliability. And so that means that most of our work is actually in supporting all the other engineers at our company. And so for me, what I've realized is that being a 10x engineer to me means making it easier for 10 other engineers to do their jobs. And I feel like if I've managed to do that, then I have managed to 10x my company. And so that's it. That's all you have to really do. And so I'm hoping that if you kind of take this idea, even if you're not a monitoring engineer, or even if you don't have your own in-house monitoring tools, you can kind of take this idea and apply it to how your teams, to your teams, and improve how your teams work with other engineers at your company. So that's kind of the secret topic of this talk. It's how to help other people do their jobs better. And so I'll cover that in 3 really broad categories. So what we identified for our team, the big 3 problems were, first, our documentation was terrible. The experience of working with our team could be improved. And we wanted to improve the experience of working with all of our tools that I had just covered. So I'll go over these 3 today, starting with documentation. So I have a bunch of questions for you, and it might hurt, but you have to be introspective with me today. So first question is, where is your documentation? Do you have it in Google Drive? Do you have it in a wiki? Do you have it in an email that you forward around because maybe some engineer wrote everything out and then you just started forwarding it and they already left the company, but you have all these new engineers? Because that's what's happening at Pinterest, or was happening. So we realized that this was a huge problem for us because everything was duplicated across multiple sources. We had a lot of, and because everything was duplicated, it was hard to figure out where to update. And for new engineers, it was hard for them to know where to find things. So for me, when I was trying to figure out what to do, I would go into Google Drive and type in some keywords and hope I would find a document that was relevant. And so what worked for our team, and you might have to figure out what works best for your company, is we made a wiki page, a single page where we included all of the information about StatsBoard or about our logging tools or about our other tools, so that people would know that there's exactly one page to go to. And that page, you could Command F, you could just type in the keywords and find exactly the question you were looking for. So that's one thing that we found was best for us, making sure everything was in a single place and not duplicated. And so the next question you should ask yourself is, does your documentation assume prior knowledge that a new engineer wouldn't have? And so a lot of us in here are really familiar with time series data or with monitoring tools. And so it's really easy to not realize that not everyone knows what aggregation means or what OpenTSDB is. And so you don't have to write out a whole essay explaining to people what OpenTSDB is, but you do have to meet them halfway and send them and share the documentation or relevant videos that they could watch if they want to get started. And so that would have been a huge help for me when I knew nothing about time series data and I was trying to figure out what to do. And finally, you should ask yourself, when was the last time anyone on your team followed the instructions? It's really easy for you to write up the instructions because when you need them, and then never look at them again. And that means that only the other engineers on your team will be the ones who follow the instructions. There's this idea that if you have a piece of software and it works and nothing changes, then it will continue to work forever. And we all know that that's not true. Things will just stop working eventually. And so it's really important to continually check that your instructions make sense. So that's what I have to say about documentation, which I think is probably the most important piece of making sure that engineers at your company are able to do their jobs at scale. And what I mean by scaling is your monitoring team might stay at a size of 5 or 8 people, But if your engineering grows from like 400 to 1,000, the documentation is what's going to get everyone where they need to go without you being awake at all hours. So now you might be asking, well, how do you maintain good documentation? You have all this great documentation, you went through and you threw everything out, you made it into a single page. But if you wait a year, of course, that documentation is going to get outdated again. And so I have three pieces of advice for how to make sure your documentation stays as good as it is. So first, add common questions as they come up. You might have a Slack channel or a mailing list that people post questions to, and if you keep seeing the same question over and over again, it's a huge waste of time for you to keep giving the same answer or typing it out again. So when you see a new question, add it to the wiki and then start linking it to people. And the other side of that coin is if you have someone asks you a question and you know the answer, it's like a short answer, and you could just like answer in a single sentence, don't just answer it. That teaches people that you'll just always be there to answer your questions. And what you should be doing instead is just linking to the documents where that answer can be found so that you teach people like there is a place where you can get these answers offline and you don't have to bother a real person necessarily. And finally, I think this is the most mind-gamey one. You should encourage everyone to contribute to the docs, even if they're not on your team. And so you might have heard of this like psychological thing where if you ask someone for a small favor, then they'll be more inclined to continue helping you in the future. And that's kind of what we do here, where if someone says like, oh, there's a typo there, or this could be better, then we say, oh, why don't you fix it? And it's a public wiki, everyone can contribute. And what that does is it makes people realize that they can fix things too. You're not the only one, so you save time because you're delegating. But also it makes people feel like they're more on your team, like they're more likely to cheer for you or want you to succeed. So next I'm going to talk about the experience of working with your team. And so there's some more questions you should be asking yourself about how your team is run. So how do people contact your team if they have questions? Some people might prefer email or instant messaging over HipChat or Slack, and some people might want to talk in person. And it's really helpful if you can offer all of those kinds of communication so that people can choose the one that's best for them. And so in our case, we have office hours where people can come to our desks and troubleshoot in person. We, of course, use Slack, and we have a mailing list so people can kind of choose where they want to go. But the other big question is how long does it take for people to have their questions answered? And so in the past, we had a lot of times where someone would ask a question and there would be dead silence. Their question would just never get answered, and then who knows what they would do next. And this is really important because if someone doesn't have a way of getting their questions answered by you, two things can happen. They could either go and ask someone else on a different team, and that person might not have the right answer, and so they might just be fumbling around trying to figure it out, or they might just give up. They might not bother adding monitoring to their tools at all. And that's a shame because you're trying to help people monitor their tools monitor their services more effectively, and so you should want them to come to you and ask for help. And so then the next question is like, what happens if someone sends you a feature request or complains about something that your team owns? And so let's say that you have someone has a feature request and you've already thought about it and you know that you don't want to implement it. You could either ignore them, you could say no, you could give them an explanation for why you're not doing it, or you could file a ticket and say, you know what, we're going to consider that maybe next quarter. And all of those things have the same end result. Like you know that you're not going to implement the thing, or you've already thought about it. But the huge difference is how that person feels about the feedback that they gave you. If you just say no, or you say, I don't want to do that, then people feel ignored and they feel like they can't work with your team. But in comparison, if you file a ticket for them, or you talk to them and explain your reasoning, then it makes them feel like they can keep coming to you and providing more suggestions. And that creates a relationship with you and the other engineers at your team company. So all these are kind of the same way of asking the big question, which is how do people feel when they work with your team? And so you might have thought, like when I said user experience in the title of this talk, that I meant like interfaces. But what I really mean is that the user experience is the experience of working with you and your team. So do people feel stupid when they talk to you? Do they feel confused or unsatisfied, like they just didn't get their answer? Or do they feel like they don't want to talk to you again in the future? And all of those things, of course, are bad. And so you want people to feel like happy, like they learned something new, like they feel supported. And that's a huge, like that's probably like 60% of just making a good user experience for our data engineers at your company. So the last thing I want to talk about, which I think is the most exciting part, once you've gotten your documentation in order, once you've figured out how to make your team the most supportive or welcoming team, is your tools. And this is what I spend most of my time thinking about. I'm going to go over some principles for what I think makes a good monitoring tool or a good internal tool. And the first principle would be to reward exploration. I've seen a lot of vendors or monitoring tools that don't quite get this right. So for example, if you click the refresh button, do you lose all of your progress on a query that you've been writing? That's super frustrating. People like to refresh a lot. Do you lose the page that you're on if you click the back button, for example? And these are all just like natural things that people do in a computer browser, but they're just things that sometimes a web app will forget to implement. And so that can be a frustrating experience. So I'll show what we did with StatsBoard. We made our graph explorer where you can type in metrics and see what's going on. And of course, as I mentioned, if you click the back button, you'll see the previous metric. I just realized that's really blurry, and that's unfortunate. So if you click the back button, you'll be able to see the metric that you were on before. So even if you're trying new metrics, you can go forward and not feel like you're losing all of your history or all of your progress. If you send someone the URL, it will actually send them the exact page of results that you're on, so it won't just link you back to StatsBoard. And these are just two really small things that people really wanted, and it's been a huge improvement for us. And we have some other small things that make it really easy to explore on this page. For example, if you click around on the legend, you can make a single metric appear or disappear on the graph without having to reload all the data. So those are all ways of making it easy for people to move around, look at things, and not feel like they're going to lose their history. Another side of what it means to reward exploration is to make it so that people aren't afraid of doing something that will just break everything. So, for example, we use Kibana at work. And there are no user accounts there, so people can, everyone shares a dashboard. But what I realized was that people are really afraid of clicking around and making changes on Kibana because they're thinking, I don't want to ruin things for all of my coworkers. So that kind of fear is kind of, I think, a big piece of being an engineer when you're working with something unfamiliar. And that's what the rest of your coworkers are dealing with. They're not on your team. They don't know a lot about monitoring. And so they're just using the tools and trying to figure things out. So if they're already nervous and unsure of what they're doing, you should make it feel like they can do things and reverse things if they've made a mistake. The next principle is to set reasonable defaults. And so that's where your team comes in. You're the experts of your domain, and so you, of course, have a lot of guidance to give. And it's really great that the last two talks were about alerting on time series data, because we built our time series previewer where you could write an alert and then check if it would have fired in the past. And that's one really easy way to tune and make sure that your alert is going off at the right times. But one thing we realized is that a lot of people don't know fully what it means to write an alert. And so, for example, you can see that this time series here is going up and down and up and down. And if you ask someone, what does it mean to alert on a certain number? They might say, oh, it's when when your time series line passes that threshold. And that's not actually always what you want, necessarily. Sometimes you do want that, but most of the time, what you would want is to take your time series, take the last like 10 minutes or 5 minutes, aggregate that number, so like average it or sum it, and then check that number against the threshold. And that's a really complicated thing to explain to someone who just thinks when the line passes the threshold, that's when I alert. And so that's a default that we set that we don't necessarily feel like it's necessary to explain to everybody who just wants to write an alert. So I realize it's hard to see here. Also, I didn't realize I had a laser pointer until I saw Bjorn using it. So this is cool. So let me zoom in here. I just realized I had that. So as you can see here, we have it set so that you always aggregate by average for the last 10 minutes by default. And so ideally, people just look at this piece, they just write in their metric and they write in their threshold, and then they just totally ignore the rest of this part. We write it in a fill-in-the-blank style, so you can kind of use natural language to say, oh, check every 30 seconds. Or for empty data, treat it as passing. And so all of these things make it really easy for people to not have to fill in anything, but for the option to be there if they do want to customize. And so that makes it really easy for people to use their intuition rather than spending a lot of time thinking about the basics of time series data. And so what I mean by that is you can see the red lines, or the really dark red right here. That's when you're actually going to get an email about a alarm. The light pink right behind it means this is triggering, but you told me to wait 30 seconds before I email you, so I'm waiting. And so people can look at that and say, like, I wanted a notification on this peak right here or on this peak right here, and now I can see like I will get an email about it. So that even if they don't necessarily know what's going on when they write an alert, and we do have the documentation to explain all of that to them, they can get started really fast and just type things and test their alerts out. So that's what I mean by setting reasonable defaults. The next thing is that what you want as an engineer, as an expert, is probably not what your users want. And this one is kind of hard to swallow, especially after the previous one, because you're an expert, you want to set the reasonable defaults, you want to build the tool that you want, but that's not always what your users want. One thing we learned is that we had our original graph exploration tool, we made it in a notebook style, so like Jupyter notebooks. We made it so you could just type in a metric, press enter, you'll see it, and then you type in another metric and you press enter and you'll see it again. And you'll just be able to see all of your history from top to bottom. And that seemed like a pretty reasonable approach, but all of the comments we got were like, this makes no sense, why are all these graphs here, why aren't they going away? And so we realized like that's just not what people want, and that's a case where the customer is right, and even if we are the experts who want to use a notebook style, not everyone wants that. So actually we did end up keeping both so that people can use the notebook if they want, but they can use the new Explorer if they prefer that. But that's one case where we had to keep telling ourselves, like, even if we think it's right, that doesn't mean it's right. Finally, the last lesson we learned was that what you know is not what your users know. And that one was a hard lesson to learn for me because I was having a lot of conversations or arguments with other engineers where I eventually realized we just weren't starting at the same place. So for example, I had mentioned earlier that Pinterest gets about 150,000 requests per second, or whatever numbers I said at the beginning. And so those are, I don't remember, I just kind of copied them from our fact sheet. So we have 150 million monthly active users, and to me that's like a pretty big number. But we're sampling our logs quite a bit, so we are storing like 1,000 logs per minute for error logging. And so to me, I'm like, oh, that's obviously a sample. You can't have like 1,000 errors per minute for like 150,000 requests per second. So I guess I never brought that up to other engineers, but we would be talking about it and they would say, hey, where's my errors? I see the error on this one host, but I don't see it inside of our logging system. And I'd say sampling, and that was like this huge light bulb moment where we'd been arguing for a while about how they thought our systems were broken, and I just thought they didn't understand how to use it. And so it turned out they just realized like, you actually throw away data. That was like a crazy concept because in a lot of other fields, you store everything. You never throw anything away. Whereas with monitoring, you usually store things for about 30 days or even less than that. And so these are a lot of things where there's just so many basic assumptions you make because you work with the data every day that you forget that other people don't realize those things. And so checking your assumptions and making sure everyone's on the same page will save you a lot of time. So to recap, if you want to have like a great user experience for your team working with the rest of your company, you gotta look at your documentation. I would say that's the most important thing. Then you gotta look at how your team communicates with other people. And finally, if you use in-house monitoring tools, or even if you use an open source tool like Grafana, hopefully you can look at how it feels in terms of like friction, or how much it like helps people explore without feeling afraid, and use that kind of information to make a better tool. Thanks.